Michele, parte subito la diretta?
Siamo partiti. I think we are live. Welcome everyone to the second edition of the Budapest European Agora. Welcome again to those who were already connected here on Zoom, and welcome to those who just joined on our streaming on YouTube. We now start the second part of the Agora. Today we are so many. We have 39 countries represented, 25 different fields of study, and diversity has always been a core value of the Agora, especially in terms of inclusion of young people coming from beyond the European Union borders. Today we have friends also from the Balkans, from the Eurasia region, and I would like to mention in particular our friends from the European Policy Center in Belgrade and the youth networks of the Council of Europe. I'm also very happy because despite the pandemic, we managed to keep our annual appointment. And for this, I'm very grateful to the team who worked hard to organize everything, to our partners, the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris, l'Académie Notre Europe, the Delors Centers at the Hertie School in Berlin, the Bertelsmann Foundation, and Scuola di Politiche from Italy. And naturally, I'm also grateful to our speaker who accepted to be with us today and share this moment. And before introducing them, just let me share with you the reason why we are here today. The Agora started last year in Budapest at the European Youth Center of the Council of Europe with 130 young Europeans coming from all over the continent. And it started with two main goals. The first one was that we wanted the Agora, as the name suggests, to be an exercise of participatory democracy, because we believe that today European integration can move forward only if citizens are at the center of the process. And I hope you enjoyed, as I did, the workshop that we just finished, because that was the meaning of giving life to this method. And I'm very thankful to Gaetan and Dominic, because despite the lack of physical presence, they found these innovative solutions to keep the method alive. And the second goal of the Agora is a broad reflection on European values, on European identities. And this is crucial for us because we see a fundamental nexus between values and policies. Values without policies are just words, and policies without values are useless and sometimes even counterproductive. And so how do you keep policies and values together? When you have a clear vision. So values, policies, and vision, this is the triad of European democracy in our opinion. And it is really starting from this triad, values, policies, and vision, that we built this year's Agora and this second part of the program. Why so? Because we believe that this trial is also fundamental for the European recovery. And I like to think about the European recovery as a bicycle. You have two wheels, right? So the back wheel is about the economy and society. It's what gives power to the bike. But you also have a front wheel, which is about democracy and institution. And the front wheel, as you know, gives direction and stability to the bike. And you need both wheels in good conditions to move. You can't go fast if you have one tire that is flat. And that is why the first intervention now will be about the European economic recovery. In a few seconds, we will be hearing from the protagonist of the recovery plan, Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni, who I warmly thank really to be here with us today. It's a privilege considering your very busy schedule. So in this first session, we will try to understand what values, what vision, what idea of Europe lies behind the set of policies for the recovery. Because as I said, there can be no recovery without values. And because the next weeks really are going to be crucial to give to this recovery a clear vision shared by everyone. But once again, this, as I said, this beautiful concept of recovery is also about democracy and institutions. I don't think we should think that an excessive deficit or unfair tax competition are more important than, for example, suspending parliament. We need to take good care of our democracies. It is something as crucial as having healthy economies. And that's why in the second part, after Commissioner Gentiloni, we will be with Kata Tutto and Kati Piri. We will hear about the situation in Budapest, which is the city that, as our name suggests, inspired the creation of the Agora. And this is because we believe that Budapest as well is a fundamental city for the future of Europe. Usually we think that the future is decided in Brussels, in Paris, in Rome, in Berlin. But here we are convinced that also what's going on in Budapest will define the fate of European integration. And finally, in the conclusion, we will try to put things together, values, policies, and vision, with our founder, Enrico Letta, to whom I really would like to express our gratitude for his support and dedication towards this project. And accompanying us in this journey will be Valerie Hopkins, Southeast Europe correspondent of the Financial Times. She is based in Budapest and she will be moderating the event. Valerie, we are so happy that you accepted to be with us today. So once again, welcome, prepare a lot of questions and have fun. Valerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michele, and thank you very much for having me. I was very privileged and honored to participate in a small way last year in Budapest, where I'm actually based. And it's a pity that we can't meet all together this year, but I'll try and facilitate as active a discussion as possible. And I'm very excited to introduce European Commissioner for Economy, Paolo Gentiloni, who's been commissioner since December, a former Prime Minister of Italy, as probably all of you know, from 2016 to 2018, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and a founding member of the Democratic Party. And I'm very excited that while COVID has brought many things to all of our lives, it brings me the opportunity to interview a European Commissioner live on YouTube in my house slippers at home. So without further ado, I would like to, as I said, this is going to be as interactive as possible. So while you are listening to the commissioner speak, please don't forget that you can ask questions whenever you want by sending a chat to the group or in the comments, or raising your hand, which is the blue hand seen somewhere on your Zoom. So, Mr. Commissioner, in February, around the time of the discovery of patient number 1 in Italy, there was a European Council meeting to work out the MFF. And some of the arguments that were going on at that time seem quite trivial compared to the current situation. I mean, there was a wrangling about the equivalent of just a little bit more than 0.0% of the EU's GDP. In only 3 months, the proposed recovery plan is now almost double the EU budget. How did we arrive here, and does this fact already represent a victory for deeper European integration?
First of all, grazie Michele, grazie Enrico for your invitation, and thank you Valerie, happy to be here participating to your Agora. Are you hearing me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
Now, yes.
No, I was thanking Michele, Enrico, and you, Valerie, for being here. Indeed, what happened and the decision taken from the European institutions in March, April, and May were really amazing. I think that if someone has thought of such an amount of decisions 6 months ago, it would be considered utopian or completely crazy. So the fact is that we were all obviously surprised by this crisis. I remember personally I was attending a G20 meeting in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia in the very day when in Italy the first lockdown were decided in some places in northern Italy, and the ministers of finance of all of the world were rather surprised, because until then, and we are talking of around the 20th of February, the outbreak was only in Asia. So then in March, we decided very important things on European rules, fiscal rules, state aid rules, and we had the first decision of the ECB. In April, we decided a very important package of loans from European institution, and in May we came with this proposal of this fund that we call now the Next Generation EU Fund. It is, I think, completely unprecedented, but indeed the crisis is completely unprecedented, and so I think it's the right answer. For the previous crisis, the Great Recession, it was said that Europe acted too little and too late. This time, until now, I would say so far so good. But then we will see, because we are still lacking the final approval of this plan, and then we need the implementation of this plan and the quality of national recovery plan. So in the back wheel, as Michele was defining economic policy, we are on a good track, but we have a lot of way to go.
Absolutely, and especially you have a bit of frustration and concern. Sweden's Prime Minister, along with the other Prime Ministers of the Frugal Four, wrote in my newspaper 2 weeks ago, asking how it could suddenly be responsible to spend 500 billion euros of borrowed money and send the bill into the future. And we have a lot of young people here today represented, some of whom, many of whom this is the first crisis, a financial crisis in their young lives, but for some of whom it's the second. And how can we convince the young people that we're not saddling them with a massive debt, and how can you convince the Frugal Four as well, who have maybe slightly different concerns?
Well, we are talking of the fact that the European Union will borrow in financial market 750 billion euros, and then will repay it in a long period in the next decades. This is, to be quite open, not such a big amount of debt service, because the debt service will be in several years, but for sure it makes important also the increasing of what here we call the European Union own resources. Not everybody knows that the European budget is not such a big thing. It's maybe less than 1/10 of the budget of a country like Italy, and so and the contribution to this budget is increasingly coming from member states' contribution connected to their GNI. And this is not, I think, a good message, because yes, member states' contribution are important, but if the Union is only depending on its budget from national contribution, this means that it is subjected to also the volatility of public opinion orientation in different member states. We need to make stronger the union to have a more important amount of own resources. And if we have a good collateral consequence of this common issuing of debt, this will be the need to have a higher amount of own resources. If we want, you know that someone, particularly the German finance minister, spoke of a Hamiltonian moment for the union. Well, I don't know if we are there. Probably we are not there. You know, Hamiltonian moment means that we are in the first step of a federal constitution of United States of Europe. This would be, from my point of view, a marvelous perspective. But at the same time, I have to be realistic in the place I am working now. And I know that this is probably something less, but extraordinarily important because it is a precedent, and Europe function on the basis of precedents. So when you establish the fact that you are issuing common debt for common purposes and common investments, this doesn't mean that you will do this for the next 20 years with the same amounts, obviously, but this means that you have established the fact that you can do this. And this is a completely different way to face the crisis from the previous one. The previous one was, if a country has a problem, you ask for rescue, and there are very strong conditionalities to lend you money to face your crisis. And this is the Troika, the memorandum, the macroeconomic adjustment programs, and all what happened to Greece or Spain or Portugal. Now it's a common crisis, and for the first time since the beginning of the European project, we are facing this common crisis with common fiscal tools. It's absolutely strategically important.
I have a lot more questions to ask you, but since we're on this topic, we have a question already from the audience. We have a few questions. We have one question from Paolo Destillo, who writes to you very informally, dear Paolo, dear Commissioner, which steps should the European Union take in order to become a proper European fiscal union? And if it's willing to take these steps, where should it start?
Well, I think we are in a starting point now. You know that the architecture of the union is, we could say, imperfect, but always architectures are imperfect because it is an architecture coming from decades of building and of enlarging our borders. So now we have a union with a single currency for 19 and perhaps in the future 21 member states out of 27. And in fact, we have a common fiscal policy only based on coordination and rules. So you have thresholds, you have common surveillance process that we call here in Brussels the European semester, etc., etc. But for the first time, this economic policy has, with this next generation EU, and in small also previously with a small program called SURE, for the first time we have firepower in our fiscal policy. We don't have only rules and thresholds, but we have also hundreds of billions to share for common goals. And this is, I think, the decisive step towards a stronger common fiscal policy. I understand member states that are rather skeptical, but what I saw after the proposal of the Commission at the end of May is very interesting, because several member states said this is not the final decision, this is only a basis for discussion. My reaction is, that's good, okay, because the really dangerous reaction would have been member states slamming the door and saying, forget it, we can't speak of common issuance of debt to finance common goals. No, the discussion is on relation grants and loans, on the key allocation of this money among member states. So it's a legitimate discussion, and I'm confident that in July this discussion will be concluded by an agreement, and this agreement, to answer to the question, would be the first real step for a common fiscal policy.
And following on that, in this vein, I mean, yesterday you had this unprecedented EU-China summit, the first occasion for the EU's institutional leadership to confer with China's top leaders. And Commission President von der Leyen said the relationship with China is one of the most strategically important, but also one of the most challenging that we have. Now we're talking also about whether or not this is a Hamiltonian moment for Europe and a strategically independent moment. I mean, is this also a big first step towards a Europe that's much more independent of not only China and Russia, but maybe even the US, given the current circumstances that they're in?
Well, I am completely agreeing with the President of the Commission, von der Leyen, on the fact that we need a more geopolitical union. This is how in the Brussels language we call this thing. So we need someone called this Europe as a quiet superpower. Do we need a quiet first? Is it possible to have a quiet superpower? This is a big question mark. But providing that it is possible to have a quiet superpower, do we need a quiet superpower? Definitely yes, because we need a superpower committed to multilateralism, committed to democracy, committed to the fight to climate change, and committed to cooperation with other countries, free and fair trade, development in Africa. So all these values should be the values of a more geopolitical Europe. Is it an easy game? Well, absolutely not. It is not an easy game, because member states are understandably reluctant to share foreign policy and defense. But I think that we need to step further on common defense policy and common foreign policy, and we need to couple these two tracks to other two tracks. One is trade. Europe is a trade superpower, maybe the biggest trade superpower in the world. And fourth track, the international role of our single currency, which is the second currency at the global level. But for sure, if you have more united foreign policy and defense policy, if you have a trade superpower, and if you strengthen the role of the euro at global level, you have a geopolitical influence. This means that you can work to avoid a new Cold War between US and China. We are not treating them as equal, obviously, because in our democratic model, there are a lot of difference between US and China. But you can try to avoid this tendency to a new Cold War, and you can have your role on strategic issues. First of all, the European Green Deal and cooperation with Africa. So the Geopolitical Commission is very difficult to achieve, I have to admit, but it's a strategic goal for our project.
And I mean, what do you see as some of the long-term consequences and impacts of this kind of confluence of changing transatlantic alliance, rising China, and all that has been wrought by COVID? I mean, how do you think it's going to change Europe's way of doing business? Are you expecting that we're going to continue to see a lot more protection? Are we going to try? What is being done to attract businesses back to Europe or to make it a bit more self-sufficient? And this is kind of, I will just shout out to another question from the audience, from Andrea Causio, who says that the pandemic has shown how the EU is relying on cheap labor in other countries for manufacturing and producing drugs and other devices like face masks. Is there a problem for reducing the cost of manufacturing in the EU, aimed at making the EU more self-sufficient? And people also, while we collect questions from the chat, we will also have a more interactive portion, so do raise your hands if you want to more directly ask a question to Commissioner Gentile. Thanks.
Well, this is a very, very big issue. How do we imagine, how do you shape the world after the pandemic? Difficult to answer in a couple of minutes, but first, unfortunately, we are not yet out of the pandemic. And I think we have to keep in mind this. We are in a deep economic crisis, and we hope that the uncertainty that is still there in the evolution of the pandemic will not make the recovery slower than we imagined. Because, as you know, well, in Europe, the exit from lockdown is going, we could say, pretty well, but the pandemic is still there all over the world, and the risk of second wave, limited second wave, is not completely excluded. So after the pandemic, but I repeat, it will be a gradual path to reach the end of this terrible story. I think first thing is to say that back to normal is not the right answer. Why? Well, I think we have risks to avoid and opportunity to seize. What are the risks? The risks are, in a nutshell, the fact that the stronger role of the state and the public that will be there in our economies in the next few years should have nothing to share with models of authoritarian capitalism. So it should be very clear that, yes, we need a stronger role of the public, of the state in our economies to recovery, but this should be completely separated from the fascination of models of efficiency of the authoritarian capitalism. Models that could come from outside, we were talking before about China, but that could be also there inside Europe, this kind of models. And the answer is no. This is not the right thing to do. No authoritarian capitalist model, no protectionist and nationalistic models. By the way, nationalistic political parties were not very strengthened by this crisis, because the idea of this crisis was that we have to share, we have to cooperate, we have to have a sense of community, not that we have to solve the problem with the strong man closing borders. So these are the risks to avoid. And the opportunities. The opportunities is that we have the opportunity now or never to make our societies more resilient, less unequal. Yesterday, I presented a report on sustainable development goals in European Union, and we saw that some inequalities are growing in the Union. We have a wider gender gap. We have economic inequalities. So more resilient, less unequal, and then to build, to recover our societies with a future-oriented perspective, both on digitization and on the European Green Deal that are the priorities of our recovery plan. So not back to normal, but risks to avoid and opportunity to seize.
Thank you so much. I promise that I will turn it over very soon to 3 people who want to ask a question, but I just want to abuse my position as moderator and ask one more, since you mentioned strong men closing borders, and this is the Budapest Agora. So I just wanted to ask you briefly about the way that the funding, that some of the emergency funding was allocated. By some calculations, you know, in the immediate transfer funds, Hungary was given 5.6 billion euros, while Italy got only 2.3. And of course, we know that Italy was far more affected by the pandemic than Hungary. And of course, I don't mean to single out Hungary. Many countries closed their national borders, of course. But in terms of the MMF and in terms of the recovery, you know, are you actively working to ensure that countries receive financing proportional to the damage that they suffered? And how are you looking towards the future MMF to also make sure that the funding is maybe distributed more equitably? And finally, do you think we need to put more conditions, that there need to be more conditions put on EU funding that's distributed to member states? Because Hungary, for instance, had the biggest number of investigations by Olaf and had to pay back some quite serious, almost 10% of its money. And then I promised to ask the audience, sorry, but I really need to.
Well, there is a discussion going on these allocation keys of the, especially of the big fund of this recovery plan. You know that the countries receiving the larger amount of money in absolute term will be Italy, Spain, and Poland, ranking third. If you take the relation to GDP in this potential allocation, I think the first couple of countries are Croatia and Bulgaria. Well, the discussion is going on. I think we are more or less trying to face the more affected countries, which doesn't mean automatically the countries that had more infections and more casualties for the pandemic, but also the countries that have the stronger potential economic consequences. Let me give you only one example. One of the countries with higher level of contribution in this plan in relation to GDP will be Greece. Greece has not been so much affected, has number of cases of this pandemic, but they had, in any case, lockdown as the other countries. And so from the economic point of view, being Greece so much dependent from transport and tourism, they are facing a very difficult situation. So this is how we treated the issue. And President von der Leyen presenting this program to the Parliament, to the European Parliament, was very clear in saying that we will not have conditionalities as we describe economic conditionalities in the previous programs, these of the previous crisis. But we will have one condition, which will be the rule of law, because the rule of law is not something for only for good economic times, and in difficult times you can say that it is not important. It will be important in our decisions to take this value at the core of the European decisions.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. I will, we have only 23 minutes left, so I'm opening it up to 3 people, Robert Dvornik, Juliette Hirsch, and Philip Schultz, who raised their hands to ask a direct question. I think we should probably take the 3 of them together and then ask the commissioner to respond. So maybe, Robert, you can go first.
Okay, so short of time,
Please
so quickly. First of all, I would like to ask you about my 3 concerns. So first of all, we talk about lots of big amount of money sent to the countries. What I have my concern is that how you would like to control increasing the prosperity gap between smaller and bigger companies. That's one thing. Second concern is about talking about knowledge transfer. How you would like to support reshaping, for example, business models and going online. And last concern that you were also mentioned about the opportunities. We know how some industries are in crisis, like tourism, airlines, and clothes, but we know how bad impact they had on climate change. First time in years, you can see bottom of canals in Venice, which is great because of the crisis. So I would like to ask if perhaps European Union would like to take opportunity of current crisis to redirect idea of economy based on consumption to more, as you said, sustainable, and how we would like to do this. These 3 things. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Juliette?
Yes, hi, thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner. I have a question on remittances, the money that migrant workers send back to their home countries, and that have been really impacted by the crisis. And I was wondering if the EU is taking any steps to mitigate this on digital finance and transfer costs and money transfer operators, for instance. Thank you.
Super interesting question. Thank you. Philip Schultz? Are you out there, Philip? No. I also saw a question from Lorenzo Ansaldo. Are you out there? I can unmute you. There we go. Here we go. Oh, sorry. Philip came back, and then we come back to you, Lorenzo, in the second round. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Philip?
sorry about that as well. My question links to something back you said, Mr. Gentiloni, and that is, you said that so if you look around the world, countries like Brazil, the USA, and Russia are countries where COVID is really rampant right now. And when we see the unified response in Europe, do you think that that will help the public perception of the European in the world, and also like democracies, that they're better able to respond to the corona crisis? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will do a second round of questions. I think we will have time. So Lorenzo's on the list. Other people, please raise your hands if you want to ask a question. Okay, we've already got it. So Commissioner, I give it back to you for those 3 questions.
Well, thank you. Yes, Robert was asking 3 separate things. One, how we the intervention on small and big companies. Yes, as you know, we decided to suspend the regular state aid framework, and we have a temporary framework, in fact, allowing to member states support to companies in a extraordinary degree. Is this being addressed mostly to big companies, this is not in the plans of member states, but it could happen. And this is one of the reasons why among the common European tools that we decided, there is one which is based on the European Investment Bank funding with a capacity up to 200 billion euros, only dedicated to small and medium companies. So member states are working both for big and small, and the European Common Tools is specially dedicated to small and medium companies. We are promoting with our investment innovation and innovation online. I think that we all learned lessons about the importance of digitization in the previous weeks and months. And then the Green Deal remains our absolute priority. Nothing has changed from this point of view, apart the fact that, yes, we will find some more difficulties than previously projected on private investment, on crowding private investment towards the targets of the Green Deal, because of the crisis of liquidity that is there in several companies. And so we need to support with public investment the commitment for the Green Deal, which is, I repeat, more than ever the main strategic goal of the European Commission. In the Juliet question, I have to say I have not a specific answer, but the Commission is doing a lot of things. Maybe we are also doing something specific to address the problem of money transfer. In my capacity, in my portfolio, I have only been dealing with a more macro problem of the debt of poorer African countries. I'm rather satisfied of the fact that we reached an agreement to suspend the service of the debt for the more 72 poorer country, mostly African. But we would like to be more ambitious, because the suspension in itself is useful, but not sufficient. Philip was asking about the perception. What about the perception of democracy? Is democracy working well, working better? Well, I think that for the time being, the supporters of authoritarian models are not the winners of this crisis, because I have no doubt that the democratic response was the right one, but I think also that the perception of the quality of the European model goes perhaps also beyond the only point of democracy. It is also connected to the welfare state, for example. Just look to the fact that in most European countries we have health public services, which is not the case in other continents. Just look to how our labor markets, not in the same level in all member states, but in most member states, were capable to react to this crisis, avoiding an immediate surge of unemployment. We had in US 40 million unemployed people in 3 weeks, 40 million. And in most of our countries, we have these schemes like Kurzarbeit in Germany, Cassa Integrazione in Italy, Chômage Partiel in France, and other forms that are keeping people at least temporarily connected to their jobs. So I think, and then the rule of law, I think we have a good experience for the European model in this terrible crisis.
Thank you so much. I mean, I hope, and we will see still if the public opinion polls actually in many European countries, including Italy, will be kind of coming back up on the solidarity front, hopefully, right? And I wanted to ask you about that, but I'm very committed to the last three people who want to ask a question. And those are, we start with Andrea Ludovico. So please, you have the floor, Andrea.
Unmute me. Okay, now I'm unmuted. Thanks. Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner. So I have a question that maybe is not strictly related to like our COVID crisis, but sees a little bit further, and it's about the Green Deal. Because like it is a fact that at the moment Europe, compared to other superpowers like in the world, is doing not that bad, considering like CO2 and regulations to actually, but also just like the sensitivity that each and every citizen has towards climate change. So my question is Europe going to do something from a like worldwide politics to try to bring other countries to the sensitivity that we have? Because, for example, in the past, when we established that refrigerators and washing machine, dishwasher needed to have a certain energy class, effectively this went like this spread through the world, and this standard were adopted worldwide. So will we, in your opinion, be leading in the future? Will we actually take bold moves to be leading in the future to bring other countries to behave in a sustainable way? Because now COVID crisis upset us all, but environmental crises are going to be worse. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Emanuele?
Hi. Yes. Good morning, and thank you very much for your for the forum. My question is going to be twofold. So we briefly touched upon the policy coordination part, Mr. Commissioner Gentiloni, and also on the fact that like we don't have a budgetary union. So we'll still agree that like on fiscal coordination we've made some step forwards. We still, I mean, like structurally cannot rely on the compliance of states, and a monetary union should be able to respond quickly and appropriately to asymmetric and symmetric shocks, such as these ones. And something unfortunately cannot be done merely through the intergovernmental bargaining. Plus, as it is, as the financial crisis 2008 and the sovereign debt crisis has shown, like we are exposed, given the structural, the institutional mechanism of the European Monetary Union, we're exposed to market speculation that is not necessarily related to economic fundamentals of countries, but can move like in a bubble-like fashion due to the inherent stability and fragility of the institutional model. And this can lead to liquidity and solvency crisis, hence to the possibility of default in certain countries, and thus to a crisis of the European Union as a whole. Given this inherent structural fragility, do you think that the recovery fund can be the right step toward the budgetary union, which is much needed in order to provide stability to the institutional structure of the EU and the European Monetary Union? And do you think that the latter like can be anyhow on the agenda in the post-pandemic agenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emanuele. And the last question goes to Lorenzo Ansaldo.
To the Commissioner Gentiloni, he said that there are some systems like Cassa Integrazione for help the workers who will lose their job. But I don't think that's the real solution for help the productive system of the very states. So, what the UE wants to help and resolve this social crisis of the worker that will lose their job? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, we have 8 minutes to wrap up all the answers to these three very different questions.
Excuse me, I didn't hear well, Lorenzo. Could you resume? Did you hear well what Lorenzo asked?
It was about the worker, how to help the worker, but I also struggled. Maybe, Lorenzo, can you just speak a little bit more slowly? I think your connection is not so great. I thought it was maybe my connection. Sorry for that.
No, it's also Mike.
Are you listening? Are you listening?
Yes.
Okay. So, Mr. Gentiloni said about the system for help workers to lose the job, like cassa integrazioni and third system of prevention. But the real problem is the productive system of the very states that will lose a lot of workers and a lot of energy of the workers. So what the UE wants to do for improve the productive system of the various states?
The productive system? Okay. Well, we lost you. No. Okay, I go ahead. I answer. Okay.
I cannot answer for you. Please go ahead.
No, I have lost you. I'm not sure to have clear the Lorenzo's question, but I will give an answer, hopefully connected to your question, Lorenzo. The first on the Green Deal, Andrea was asking. I think something is sure and something is uncertain. What is sure is that the European Commission will keep this strategic priority at the center of our agenda. So if someone had in mind the fact that this is not time to look to the future of the planet, this is time to look to the future of your household in the next weeks, and put these two issues in contradiction, the Commission has a different point of view. It is exactly now that we will invest a lot on the recovery and on the future of our economies that we have to try to shape them according to more environment sustainable model. We all know that this will be a challenge for the EU, and for this reason we are working on some measures that will make this challenge less dangerous. For example, as you probably know, we delivered a fund which is called Just Transition Fund, and which will try to help specific geographic areas and sectors more in difficulty to make this green transition in different countries. And then we are working on something that we call, sorry for the Brussels labels that are very complicated, the carbon border mechanism, adjustment mechanism, CBAM, which is more commonly called the border tax, carbon border tax. But the mechanism has a very clear scope to avoid that our jobs and our companies will be affected by unfair competition coming from companies and countries with much less severe rules on environment. So we need mechanism to avoid this disadvantage for the European companies and works. We will be very serious on this, and this I can assure. Will we be able to have a leadership at a global level from this point of view? This is more uncertain. I have to be honest, because we need the two main superpower on board, for example. And yes, we have China on board formally on the Paris Agreement, but it is a hard task for China and difficult to understand how much China is willing to lead in this issue. And we have, as you know, our American friends reluctant to be in the lead and abandoning the Paris Agreement. And we have difficulties with Brazil. So to have this leadership is absolutely necessary. Who else, apart from EU, can have this global leadership? But will we be able to move the other great producers of damage to the environment in the right direction? This is only partially in our hands. It is very much on the hands of public opinion. I think that we make these major steps also thanks to the movements that were pushing in this direction, Greta Thunberg and all this Friday for Future. You can joke about this, but you shouldn't, because they were absolutely crucial in helping the Commission to take this decision. Emmanuel and fiscal coordination. Emmanuel described perfectly the risks that we have and that we were running, risks of non-intervention, and so of a repetition of the crisis of 10 years ago, with risks for the financial sector, for sovereign debts, etc., etc. I know that we had these risks, but I have to say that European reaction was really fast and strong. And if you look to financial markets, despite the fact that member states are spending unprecedented amount of money, just look to German expenditures, for example. Despite this, we have rather stable financial markets. So I am not saying that these risks are cancelled. I'm saying that action taken both by the ECB and by the European Commission and European member states were absolutely crucial and at the moment sufficient to avoid this kind of risk. It is true, as Emanuele said, that to avoid them in a permanent and stable way, we need also to make more stable progress towards the monetary union and the real fiscal union. But these steps, these decisions were absolutely essential to avoid the risks that Emanuele was describing. Lorenzo, if I understood well your question, I agree on the fact that the mechanism like the Kurzarbeit or Cassa Integrazione or others similar are important because you can avoid that during a crisis you lose companies and jobs, but are by definition temporary mechanism. So we need at the same time to increase the quality of our labor market and competitiveness of our economy. I think that both these targets will be essential in our recovery plan. The quality of labor market means that other sectors of workforce need to be protected, those that are frequently younger and without the same protection that you can address with Kurzarbeit or Cassa Integrazione. And second, we need to increase productivity and competitiveness of our systems, especially in some countries, if we want that this recovery will bring us really to more resilient economies. Valerie.
Thank you so much, Mr. Commissioner. We're running just a little bit over, but I think it's really incredible that you made the time actually today to talk with us, take questions directly from young people across Europe in the true spirit of the Agora. And we wish you a lot of success in continuing to engineer and implement the recovery that we all depend on.
Grazie. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. And we will continue here at the Agora now with a discussion a bit closer to our Budapest home, although of course we are scattered all over Europe. We have with us today Kata Tuto, the Deputy Mayor of Budapest, and Kati Piri, an MEP from the Netherlands. So I think they should be. Can we ask you to show yourself?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Hi. See ya.
And I'm here as well.
Yeah. Greetings, greetings. Well, I think it's going to be great. So we've talked a lot now about the financing, but now we've got to talk a bit about the politics and the democratic values that we were discussing during the introduction to today's event. So maybe I start by asking Kata, if you would describe for us, we have people from all over Europe. I don't have the stats actually about how many nationalities, but maybe not everyone has been following Hungarian politics as closely as I have from my base in Budapest. But in October, a coalition of opposition parties achieved something that many would have thought was unthinkable in Viktor Orban's Hungary, where Mr. Orban is currently serving his 4th term, and that is winning mayoral seats in almost half of Budapest's biggest cities. So can you maybe describe how it was that you did that, and what has happened since then? And then we will come back to maybe Piri for a bit of a zoom out view of the state of sort of democracy in Europe, and the fact that, you know, does this show actually that democracy is as vibrant as ever, the fact that you were able to do this. So thank you, Kata.
Well, thank you. I'll try to give a really, really short, like, historical context, because otherwise it's really hard to understand why was this something big we achieved like last October. So it started back 2009, 8 and 9 with the economic crisis, which after Viktor Orban, the current prime minister's ruling party, won the elections in 2010, winning 2/3 of the seats in the parliament. And their, not the main objective, one of their main tools is to, after getting in power, to switch off step by step all checks and balances, all democratic control. So like step by step from 2010 until like today, they were checking out every control point. There were huge attacks on NGOs. there were a lot of centralizations, taking away power from the local and regional authorities. Like currently, there are no regional authorities really in Hungary without any power. Every local role of cities and regional authorities and local authorities was centralized, like centralizing healthcare, centralizing education, centralizing tax revenues, tying the hands of the mayors. There was a huge buyout and centralization in the media. So today, like there is one Central European Media and Press Foundation, which consists of more than 500 media outlets, which means a lot of TVs, local radio channels, local newspapers, online media, local and national, and it's all controlled by people who are loyal to the governing party. And like most of the government's media spending goes directly through this foundation. So like NGOs, free press, local and regional authorities, changing the election system. So like with 44% of the votes, the governing party can have 2/3 seats in the national parliament. And of course, one of the most important part is limiting the power of jurisdiction. And even they took control over the National Academy of Sciences. So one part was checking out checks and balances. It's not done yet, but like they're going step by step. There's a huge agitation propaganda campaign, something from the socialist time. Like my parents remember the campaigns we are seeing today. I brought you something to understand. Like there is like a Hungarian innovation. It's called national consultation, which means that every grown-up Hungarian receives a letter from the government where they can answer questions. And it is said that we are talking, the government has said we are asking the people and we will do as people tell us. This new consultation is about, we just received it. It's colorful and a lot of happy people on it. And it is about national consultation on the coronavirus and the restart of the economy. And the most of the questions are like, I will just show you a few questions, okay? Like, it is on the coronavirus. And question number 13 says that Brussels is preparing to attack the Hungarian constitution. Brussels wants to force the Hungarians to change our constitutions, which bans migration. So the Hungarian government is asking the people, do you agree that the Hungarian government should protect its laws and stop migration in an open conflict with Brussels? And this is on the coronavirus. It's a national consultation. Another question is on, they were building up enemies from the beginning. So there's a constant freedom fight from 2010. So the Hungarians were freedom fighting against the IMF and then the EU. But the EU concept is still a really positive concept among the Hungarians. So the government is not fighting the European Union, but it's fighting Brussels, the Brussels bureaucrats, the big enemies. EU is a good thing and Brussels bureaucrats is the bad thing. And they found a new enemy a few years ago. It's not a Hungarian innovation. I think the idea came from Bulgaria. George Soros, who is Hungarian born, the founder of the Open Society Foundation, and he was an active partner of all former Hungarian governments. He even financed a lot of education of the current Fidesz members in government. So he became the new enemy. So also this national consultation has a question on the European Court of Justice just ruled that the Hungarian laws on keeping people, migrants in transit zones without giving them food and proper health care, that this is illegal. There was a European Court of Justice ruling. And this national consultation is asking the people, telling them that this ruling goes hand in hand with the big plan of George Soros, who wants to flood the country with 1 million migrants yearly. This was the thing that they spread. So do you agree that the government should step up against migration and protect the borders? I just wanted to show you like a few things, because this is written down. And this is the environment we're working. So there's switching off of checks and balances, like free press is something in distinction, it's disappearing. The opposition is really divided. And the governing party does a lot to divide the opposition. So what happened last October was some sort of like last hope, that we all knew that the only way to take back power on the local level, to like grasp the last straws of democracy, is if all the opposition parties stick together and form a big coalition. And we could do that last October. And with this, even in this environment, we won Budapest, the opposition won Budapest with a program of creating a free city, a greener city, and a more European city. So that was the main policy, that we will give back power to the people. There was participation all over the campaign. What we did is we used something we never used before, like primary elections, like in the United States. We didn't have this institution in the Hungarian politics. Nobody believed in it in the beginning that this could work. But we, among the opposition parties, we held like 2 rounds of primaries to choose the candidates for Budapest. We were involving the people, we were out in the streets, and we were united. And this worked in Budapest. This is not just a technique. I mean, without the technique, probably it wouldn't work if you wouldn't form a coalition. But also the program was a different policy, in huge contrast with the government's policy of centralizing everything and telling people what to do. And I think this is a road for us in the future. We will have national elections in 2 years. I'll stop now because I was a bit long. Good to see you, Kati.
Thank you so much, Ms. Tuto. I want to come back to you for sure and talk about how Hungary has dealt with the coronavirus, what the government response has been, and how that has also affected the opposition and the state of democracy. But I want to come to Piri first, who you do, and it's great to have you here because you have Hungarian roots. As I understand, you were born in Hungary, raised in the Netherlands, and keeping a very keen eye on what's going on in Hungarian politics. And I wonder, you know, Ms. Tuto outlined for us kind of the general state of affairs in Hungary, the way that Viktor Orban plays off the EU in some ways while relying on it tremendously for funding. For those of you that don't know, the EU funds account for between 4 and 5% of Hungary's GDP every year, at least in the previous budget cycle. And yet he's taken a fairly combative line. So I wonder, you know, how do you see this from Brussels, from The Hague, and how do you, and do you think that the EU currently has adequate tools for trying to push back against maybe a democratic deficit, and B, you know, repeated and regular anti-EU rhetoric?
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you also for this invitation. And it's great to see Kata also, at least online from a distance, 1,300 kilometers. But I'm happy to see all these active young people here in the meeting. Well, it's one of the most frustrating issues, to be honest, Valerie. I mean, everyone who follows the developments in Hungary knows this is not something of the recent past. This has been going on for now almost a decade. And in this decade, we saw, one right after the other being harmed. And does the EU have the tools? I believe the EU does have the tools, but what it is missing is the backbone, the political backbone to actually do something about it. When things started to go bad in Hungary, when Viktor Orban came to power again after a couple of years and he started changing the constitution, people thought, well, it's a country which is not in the Eurozone, so it won't affect us that much. You will see there will be elections again, a new government, we don't have to interfere. And what happened was actually not that Orban disappeared and we had a new government, but what happened is that in Poland, we got a kind of similar authoritarian type of regime with a government. And you saw actually, the Orban type of politics being spread over Europe rather than just disappearing by itself. Like you said, Valerie, it's true. I mean, the authoritarianism of Orban is funded from Brussels, because there's not a single country in Europe that receives so much funding from the EU as Hungary does. And this also makes it, for me in the Netherlands, inexplicable to explain. We have pro-European voters who really are also understanding that in solidarity, a richer country like the Netherlands should, of course, pay more for the development of poorer regions or for poorer countries, but they can't explain, and I can't explain to them, why their taxpayers' money is disappearing in the pockets of Viktor Orban and his friends. So can we do something about it? Yes, we can. And I think this is the moment to do it. We are having the discussions right now on the next funding for the next 7 years. It's called, with a difficult word, it's the multi-financial framework. And I can tell you, and together with me, my political group, which is the second largest in the European Parliament, will not agree with a new budget if there is no strong conditionality on rule of law. And that's not because I don't think there are poor regions in Hungary. There are poor regions in Hungary, and I think we should be able, to lift them up and to help them in further development. But we know that money is not going there. We know the money is staying with Viktor Orban, his family, and his very close friends. So that's, we have the tools, as you know, also. Article 7, I mean, this is the kind of sanction mechanism that you can do against one of the member states if there is a constant infringement of the rule of law. Well, this debate here in the Parliament, we have voted for this 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. And in the Council of Ministers, with the Prime Minister sitting together, they're still discussing it. And depending on which country has the presidency, the discussions are actually intense or not taking place at all. For instance, now under the Croatian presidency, rule of law, it's not an issue for the Croatian presidency. So we have to wait again for the Germans to discuss it. So I always also expect, to make it short, that our prime ministers speak out, and speak out not in the way that they did. Remember 3 months ago, when in Hungary, this emergency legislation was voted through and 13 EU countries wrote a letter. I mean, really, okay, they got a very good course in diplomacy. So they wrote a very diplomatic letter, not naming the country, that, countries, their legislation, the emergency law should be temporary, it should be proportionate. And everyone knew it was about Hungary. But as diplomats do, they didn't write it down in the letter. What did Viktor Orban do? He signed the paper. He signed, yes, I agree, it should be temporary, it should be proportionate. That's not the way to deal with a dictator inside the European Union. And I'm sorry to say this stuff. I think what the opposition did in Hungary last year was remarkable. And it also shows that there is another side of Hungary, of Hungarian voters who really want to see change. But we also, in the other European countries, also in this Brussels bureaucracy, we should be there to help the real Democrats in Hungary. And right now, actually, we are only helping Viktor Orbán.
Thank you so much, Ms. Puri. I want to come back and talk to you about some potential ways that you think Brussels can help democratic forces. But let's come back to Ms. Tuto, who's mute, if you can unmute yourself, and ask a bit about how Hungary reacted during the pandemic. I mean, I have two questions. You know, one is Ms. Piri just called Hungary a dictatorship, but you were able to achieve this kind of success. So I wonder, you know, and the government was very clear in trying to say the fact that this happened shows that democracy is thriving in Hungary. So I wonder if you could just briefly respond to that and then sort of focus a bit on how you see Hungary's response to the virus, what kind of measures it took that maybe were not necessarily needed to combat the virus itself or the economic recovery, and some sort of state of play now that the state of emergency that was imposed that gave Prime Minister Orbán the power to rule by decree indefinitely is being lifted. So, and then we'll come back to Ms. Piri, and then I promise to open it up for questions.
Okay. When I'm talking about switching off checks and balances, it's not every switch being turned off yet. So, and I think it serves the interest of the current ruling party that to leave like some switches on. But I think I see that it's really hard to control themselves, not to turn everything off. Because as long as there is some European money at stake and some threat about the rule of law, some of those switches will be turned on. And we are holding to those straws as like opposition, those people who want to change this regime, who want to live in a European democracy. So we're trying to grab these straws and use the left assets we can, but we believe in the future, so we are optimists that this will bring change. Going back to the pandemic, Hungary was a lucky country in a lot of ways. Budapest was lucky, Hungary was lucky. The pandemic arrived much later than in neighboring countries, so we had a lot of experience. We were watching what's happening. We were watching what's happening in our closest neighbor, Austria. The pandemic arrived there much earlier. So we were seeing what's happening. We're seeing all their dilemmas, and we had time to prepare. We were seeing what's happening in Italy, and everything arrived many, many weeks later than in these other countries. We will see the truth like probably in 1 year's time when exactly what arrived. But I think it's it's an interesting fact that the Hungarian government only recognized officially that the virus arrived when they found the first foreigner affected. So it wasn't a Hungarian that was the first infected, but they announced that this virus came through migration. That it was, I think, Iranian students here who were diagnosed with the virus. It wasn't a Hungarian thing. And when I go back to this national consultation, you see that now the coronavirus is now closely linked with migration, and migration means in Hungary illegal migration. So the whole thing is now wrapped together. So what I wanted to say that in all together, Hungary was lucky that because we started testing really, really late, and we didn't know exactly what's happening. We as Budapest didn't get any data from the government. So what we've seen is we have a lot of connections with a lot of cities. We were asking them on what's happening. So like other European cities, how to move on, what they experience. But we've seen that those can fight really effectively, who go like hand in hand together, local level, regional level, national level, that there should be a close cooperation in a state of emergency and a pandemic nobody had ever seen before. Every one of us was learning new things on testing, on PCR testing and serologic testing, and wearing masks, not wearing masks. Everybody was doing the same thing all around Europe. And our closest partners on our dilemmas weren't our national government, who wasn't talking to us. We were told that we have nothing to do with the pandemic. We were talking to like other European cities, our twins and allies on, okay, what's happening and how to move on, which I don't think is a normal way to go on with the pandemic. But in Hungary, in the end, we only had a few thousand in the whole country. It's a 10 million country. We had like a few thousand infected altogether. And what we found out, that infection spread like morely in institutions. So it was hospital based, it was spreading in hospitals, in the healthcare system, and it moved from the hospital, unfortunately, to the elderly care and elderly care institutions, like in other countries, which happened. We've seen this from the beginning, but we face the same thing, that there weren't sufficient testing in the country, there weren't sufficient testing in the healthcare system. We didn't have enough assets to protect from the beginning, but we were lucky that a lot of things arrived later, and the curve was much lower than in other places, probably because we had time to prepare. We closed down the country and closed down the city quite early. Yeah, you wanted to ask a question?
Well, I just to ask if you see that, you know, the rate is the success that the government claims. I mean, if you could talk also about the political response to the virus, how the parliament reacted, and what the government, the decrees that the government started to pass after Mr. Orban got the right to rule by decree.
When we were in the middle of the crisis, we thought that everything's coming very late. Very late. And I think we still think we were lucky, because if I see like the numbers of other countries, like Eastern countries, they had the same low rates. So, and if we do the analysis of the whole thing, we will see that Slovakia had a very low rate, Slovenia had, Croatia, Romania, Greece, and they were all doing differently. So what we always said, that the government believes that politically there's a one way, that every power goes to the government and they will decide, and they're not sharing information, and they are taking over control. We said that there are other ways where the local level is also involved, because actually we are the ones who meet the citizens who are losing their jobs, who has to stay at home with their children because there's no school and no nursery, and we should be making our decisions together on protection, on wearing masks, on public transport, on cleaning the streets. So we were really left alone, and that was not the norm everywhere. So there were different ways, but we have to see it like in 1 year's time what will happen. We were afraid of this state of emergency, that this law with an indefinite period of time, but it ended. So we didn't know this will happen, because we really have bad experience that what the government says and actually does rarely goes in line.
Well, the 2015 state of emergency that was declared for migration is still in effect. I mean, it continues to get extended every 6 months, right? So
sure, and now they're picking up the migration issue again. So now migration, virus is going hand in hand, and the migration issue is coming back on the agenda. The election campaign is starting in October, so probably this will be still the main issue.
Okay, so Ms. Piri, I wanted to ask you, I mean, on March 30, the Hungarian parliament passed this emergency legislation giving the prime minister the right to rule by decree. The very next day there was already discussion of classifying the largest infrastructure project in history, the Chinese-built Budapest-Belgrade Railway. There was another provision to, remove the ability of transgender people to change their names and their gender identities. There were decrees removing funding, crucial sources of funding for the opposition, like local vehicle and registration tax, or creating special economic zones that again took the tax revenue away from opposition-led municipalities. These are things that didn't necessarily have any immediate things to do. And so how that Hungarian government has been very vocal in saying, we, the state of Germany, every policy. But I'm just wondering, everybody did, but I'm wondering how these non-related things are seen in Brussels, considering is everybody's now grappling with the economic fallout.
Thanks, Valerie. You were hampering a little bit, but perhaps it's my connection, or perhaps it was yours. But I think I understood more or less the question, how all these measures are viewed in Brussels, right? You can hear me and see me? Yeah, okay, perfect.
Yes.
Well, and perhaps you even said it, but I didn't hear it. The Hungarian government now even asking for apologies from Brussels, right? For all those people who are criticizing the legislation. Well, let me say the Hungarian emergency measures, of course, a lot of countries took emergency measures. And were they extraordinary? Yes. And was it necessary in many ways? Yes. Was it infringing on the rights of people? Absolutely. We saw infringements, all over Europe on the freedom of movement, on the freedom of assembly, the freedom of expression. All of these fundamental rights were somehow infringed in actually almost all of our countries. Then the question is, if you have these emergency measures, is it proportionate to the threat? Is it proportionate to the great health risk that coronavirus is still facing many of our countries? And here my answer to the Hungarian emergency measure is clearly no. It was not proportionate at all. All the examples you are giving now, how were they related to protecting Hungarian people from the coronavirus? They weren't. There were actually all kinds of measures taken because somehow, authoritarian people can't resist the temptation if they see a gap to even grab more power to do it. That's exactly the temptation that Viktor Orban saw in front of him at the beginning of this pandemic. Now, like Kata said, I think one of the other, of course, big concerns was the fact that it was indefinite, right? So there was no end date to it, which for any emergency measure is still wrong. The fact that it ended still doesn't mean it was good that they put an indefinite date there. So we should now be thankful for Viktor Orban to involve again the democratic process in a way, or the parliament in these discussions. I think we still have to be very vigilant. We know his tendencies. We know he doesn't show a lot of respect to the voters of those, to those people who are voting not for his party. He's there. He's not the prime minister. He doesn't want to be the prime minister for the whole of Hungary. No, he only wants to be the prime minister for those 44% who vote for him. But he, as a prime minister, should also, respect the opposition and respect their voters, which are millions of people in Hungary, as we know. So for me, if you ask how did Brussels look at it, we were very critical of this legislation. I think we now have to be very vigilant, because let's not forget, now that these emergency measures are coming to an end in many of the European countries, also in my country, we are making now new legislation which is highly debated topics, which infringements of fundamental rights should be in the new legislation to deal with this new situation. For instance, the 1.5 meter distance, or all the discussions we have about privacy when it comes to, how to make sure you can trace who you've been in contract with. So these are heavy discussions, really, I think, which could be fundamental to the future of our democracies. And we need to make sure that we are very vigilant also with the new legislation that is coming up in Hungary. It's one thing to end the emergency legislation. If you then put it all into real legislation with the 2/3 majority they have in the parliament, it didn't get any better. And, it makes me also sad to hear what Kata is saying, that, again, we are facing a situation where, thank God, in Hungary it was not so severe as in many other European countries, and let's hope there won't be a second or third wave where Hungary will be hit harder. I think this is, of course, something we are all scared of. The virus is still there. But how, when people are losing their jobs with all these insecurities, when we also know about the Hungarian healthcare system, how is it possible that this man can still turn the debate against what he calls migrants, against refugees, to fuel this debate with hate against those people who are not Hungarian? And then you can define it in many other ways. I mean, this is what we, I think, as Democrats, and also what democratic politicians, progressive politicians should be fighting against. How, under these circumstances, winning that ideological battle, that means we are doing something wrong if he will succeed in doing that.
Well, just really briefly, because we have only a little bit more than 20 minutes for the audience questions, and we have a long line of people. I just wanted to ask for your perception. I mean, what we saw and what we were discussing as well with Commissioner Gentiloni is that, in the short term, at least, so far, populists have done pretty bad out of the corona crisis. I mean, the AfD in Germany has been going down. Salvini has become quite unpopular in Italy. But, the recovery is going to be very, very, potentially very slow. And I wonder if you fear that the decrease in support for populists more broadly in Europe is very fragile, or do you think that the emergence from this crisis will prove to voters who voted maybe for a populist party that actually more established parties are the type of parties that you need in a crisis?
Well, it's if we would say wishful thinking, we would say, you see, these populists are not delivering, etc. But unfortunately, I have to say, it really depends per country. Yes, I think Putin has a big problem for failing to deal with this crisis in a transparent and in an effective way. I think, and I hope, Trump will have a big problem in November with the elections for, having this 25% of your population without any, losing their jobs, without any safety net, the anger that is fueling, with thousands of people dying. Bolsonaro is really not doing, I think, a great job in fighting this pandemic. On the other hand, we have to look at Erdogan. Erdogan is not known as a big Democrat either, but in a way, I think he managed during this coronavirus to make sure that it stays, in proportion, that it didn't spread through a country of almost 90 million citizens. It had less cases than in the Netherlands, where we have 17 million citizens. So I think you see in general terms that people, this was a time that you were so dependent on the government, whichever government might be there, that unless you really screwed it up, like some populists did, you right now have the credit for it by the citizens. Having said that, I think this will not last very long. I think you already see the huge polarization in politics, but also in the population. I see it here in my own country, in the Netherlands, where we have parts of the people who really think we should, remain very vigilant, have strict rules in order to protect the vulnerable. And we have half of the people who say, come on, what is this 1.5 meter rule? We should get rid of it, restart our economy. We can put the elderly people in the elderly homes and let's live our lives like before again. So you see the polarization, and with polarization, I think populist parties are normally doing very good. Now, it depends whether the democratic parties are really taking care of those people who are now hurt the most by this crisis. Like I said, millions of people also in Europe are losing their jobs, if not at the beginning, perhaps in the coming months, because a lot of governments took, of course, big economic measures to prevent them from losing their jobs in the first time. But we have now, restaurants, bars, even if they're open, they're empty. On the one hand, because people don't have the money to go there. On the other hand, because people are scared to sit inside in a restaurant. So we have a lot of businesses which are in a very difficult position. And if we leave those people alone now, if we pretend when we have a vaccine that everything can go back to normal and forget to care about the vulnerable in our societies who have lost their jobs, who are not feeling secure, populism will rise again. And we also, I think one thing we can be sure of, that this crisis is much deeper and longer than we thought from the beginning. So also its aftermath and the consequences will certainly cost us a couple of years to get out of it. And then I think it's also up to, to the main political parties to actually address those grievances which are rightfully there, I think, with a large part of the population now, or otherwise populists will do it.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have 5 people with their hands raised. I propose trying to take all of them at once. And please, just a reminder, if you can introduce yourself and tell us where you're from, that would be preferable. So I give the mic first to William Alexandre, if you're out there.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hello, so my name is William Alexandre. I'm a French citizen, but I'm currently living in Luxembourg. And so my question is dealing with the ECJ ruling of the 18th of June. And I would like to have the reaction of the speakers on how do they host that judgment, and what is the Hungarian government's reaction to that judgment on the fact that the Hungarian law against NGOs is illegal regarding EU law. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next we go to Strahinja Subotic. Ciao, Strahinja. If you're out there, there we are.
Thank you for unmuting me. Thank you. I have a question for Mrs. Kati Piri. I'm a researcher from Serbia. I work at the European Policy Center. And as you know, we had recently elections in Serbia. We have similar trends as in Hungary. But here, our president and his party has control of the 3/4 of the assembly. And we de facto have a one-party system in our country, fortunately. You were quite vocal, as I saw, against this elections, saying that the democracy doesn't really properly function in Serbia. And you have even called for not opening any more chapters with Serbia until the democracy is fixed. Can you tell me more about why you said this, and what was the reaction among your colleagues? And how likely is it that the council, who decides on whether the chapter should be opened, how likely is that the socialists in the council would agree with your suggestion? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Strahinja. Tommaso.
Hello, I'm Tommaso. I'm from Italy. I study European Studies, and thank you for your enlightening words. I would ask to both of the speakers, what do you think is the role of the cities in this Europe? If they, we are listening a lot talking about, for example, what it is happening in the US. So do you think that cities have an important role to play also in Europe? And what do you think that is their way to enact this role? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question and something I really want to talk about. Sena Maric.
Thank you, Valerie. I'm also from European Policy Center, Belgrade, and I have a short question to Ms. Piri. You said that you would, as a group, as an S&D group, really insist on attaching conditionality to the new EU funds dedicated to structural funds, in short. Do you think you would ensure support of the members within your party from the Central and Eastern European countries? Do you have any challenges in that respect? And this particular interests us because back in our homes, we're advocating for much stricter and more effective conditionality of the EU when they allocate the pre-accession funds to the candidate countries. So this issue is quite close to our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the last question of this round, Robert Dvornik. Back for more.
Yeah. Back for more. Yes, can you hear me? Because I'm from Poland, so I can't not respond to Mrs. Fury and Tuto as my neighbor. One thing, in Poland, we also had communism and propaganda. And what I had and observed, more propaganda doesn't mean that people more believe to this. Actually, it's more propaganda, they less believe in it. And that's why I would like to ask, what happened that was such a big problem for opposition in Hungary to come up together? Finally, they did it, and there was some succeed. So this is one question. To Mrs. Piri, because she talked about Poland and the elections, I have to say one thing. One of the journalists came to the countryside in Poland and asked him, why do you vote for this party who just break the law and everything? And he said, look, I'm a pensioner, and for all my life, for the last 8 years, I was eating potatoes and milk because my pension, I could not afford it. So I don't care about the laws until the government finally give me a bigger pension for food. So maybe I would like to ask you to make it a question from it. What's your take in the European Union for social programs when we see that people who kind of have problems with financial problems will take anything and anybody will vote for anybody just to get this kind of what they say dignity back?
Thank you so much, Robert. Well, we have a lot to unpack and unfortunately not enough time to do it. Maybe we go to Ms. Tuto first. We have a question about the ECJ ruling, the role of cities in Europe, and potentially if you also want to address the idea of stricter conditionality for EU funds and or challenges of social programs, Ms. Tuto.
Oh, okay. I'll just pick on those which were directed to me. Yeah. On the ruling, the Hungarian government stated that they are right. I mean, the Hungarian government, that the people has the right to know where the NGOs get the financing from. And the Hungarian government, the Minister for Justice was criticizing the ruling that it didn't put facts behind its ruling. So nothing will change. That was the Hungarian government's answer to that people has to know where these NGOs get their financing from, because this is all interconnected. Migration, illegal migration, NGOs, it was all packed together, and it's all said that everything is funded by George Soros through the Open Society Foundation to realize this plan of him to have a lot of migrants all over Europe and to crush this Christian European roots of the country. So that's the same story. So the government has said that everything stays as it is. Role of cities. I'm a member of the European Committee of the Regions. We are talking a lot about the role of cities, and as deputy mayor and a European politician, when we talk about European politics, getting closer to citizens, it is through the local and regional authorities, because actually the mayors and the local authorities are the ones who are actually meeting the people, who can actually deliver the message in both ways. We are the ones who may meet those who are in need and those who want to change. So we've been talking about this for a long time, how to empower cities, how to empower local authorities, how to change to a more participation, how to involve citizens. So this is what we're working on in Hungary, in the European Committee of the Regions, because it's not just about the successful European policies, because its implementation is mostly on the local level, but it's also about democracy. So the involvement of citizens, that's the best way to do it from the local level. On the why was it so hard to get together for the opposition parties? It's quite easy to answer that question, because Fidesz was optimizing the election system to a party structure where there is one party, doesn't have to have 50%, it has to be huge enough, but being somehow in the middle. It's called the central force field. This comes from physics, but this is how it's called also in politics. So they were like middle right. And so there were a lot of opposition parties forming also on the right, and of course on the left was divided, liberals, leftist parties, and extreme right parties. So getting together a liberal and extreme right, a green liberal, a conservative green, and a social democrat, that's not an easy way. So what was in common? One thing is common, that we want to live in a democracy. And in the beginning, it wasn't even common to live in a European democracy. So it was a long way to find the common roots, and that is we want to live in a democracy. So this is how the opposition parties could come together to protect our democracy. But it wasn't it's not a technical thing. It's we don't really agree in everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tom. So now, Ms. Piri, we have the question about Serbian elections and the proposal to not open any more chapters and whether or not you are worried about a de facto one-party system. More questions about conditionality of EU funds, and also the role of social welfare payments, really, in populist politics. Thanks.
Thank you all very much for, I think, very nice questions. On Serbia, well, we saw indeed yesterday the elections. We knew, of course, in advance, there was, again, a disagreement between the opposition and ruling party about the date of the elections. As you know, part of the opposition also boycotted the elections, although we were not in favor. We are never in favor of a boycott of elections. But, we already knew, even if the opposition would or would not participate, that we have very serious problems with democracy in Serbia. And unfortunately, not a lot of attention is paid to it, right? We always speak about Europe and the problems. We always mention then Hungary and Poland. I think Vučić, his Serbia clearly fits, unfortunately, into the same pattern. And then it's not very helpful to have a European commissioner who should be neutral. I should not be neutral, right? I'm the vice president of the Socialists and Democrats responsible for foreign affairs. So I can be partisan, but the commissioner should be neutral. But he seems to be a very Fidesz commissioner who is praising Vučić, who is critical when it comes to the former ruling party in Macedonia, which does not belong to the EPP family. So we also have a problem there when it comes to the messengers from Europe. Not opening chapters. Yes, I think it's, I'm a big, how do you say that? You see, when you are too often Zooming at home and not in Brussels all the time, your English gets a bit rusty. But I'm very much in favor of enlargement, because I think it's one of the most important tools the European Union has in foreign policy. So no mistake about that. On the other hand, I'm also politicians from the Netherlands. in the Netherlands, it's not an easy topic to talk about the enlargement of the European Union. And the only way that I can defend it, and I think the only just way to do it, is to be strict, when it comes to conditions on media freedom, one of the biggest problems in Serbia, but unfortunately in several other Western Balkan countries as well. When it comes to the rights of minorities, when it comes to respecting the rule of law. These are for me conditions that not just because in Holland we are critical about enlargement, because I believe that's the type of European Union that I want to live in, where we uphold these values. So yes, as far as my group is concerned, and this goes for the whole group, otherwise I would not be able to make a press release about it. We shouldn't open chapters with Serbia until we see no improvement there. And as you know, the way it works with chapters, you need unanimity among the EU member states to open a chapter. So I also don't expect that the Council will think otherwise. I think there are enough EU member states who are critical about the developments there. So I don't think the Council will decide otherwise, because they simply won't have the unanimity to open chapters. Then the question on conditionality and the push for that, is this also agreed by all Eastern European colleagues in my political family? I think they're divided. I think they're divided also meaning whether they are in opposition or they are in a ruling party, where that's a division you see more often. I think we also have a great variety of social democrats in the SND group, as unfortunately we have in many groups. You have a variety of liberals or you have a variety of Christian Democrats. But for sure, a big majority in my political family believes conditionality on rule of law in the MFF, in the multi-financial framework, is key. And for me, it will be decisive on my vote. And as you know, the European Parliament will have to vote on the new multi-financial framework. And I'm very happy. Last week, the 5 political groups, the Radical Left, the Greens, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the European People's Party came together with a letter to the Council, what will be the European Parliament's majority's conditionality on the budget, and the rule of law was mentioned there. And this is a role we take very serious as Parliament, where we often, like even in the German-French proposal, to my surprise, although I like the proposal when it comes to economics, they didn't mention rule of law. And I would have expected at least differently from Angela Merkel and Macron. So I'm sure that's one of the problems. It's not that they don't believe in it, they forgot it probably. And then on the question on Poland and social policies, I see very well your point. I think, why talk about the rights of minorities, or about the independence of judges if you don't have food on the table, right? So, and as a social democrat, who would I be to say that the social issues are not important? I think they're key. I think they're the most important. If you don't have a livelihood, you don't even have time to care about other issues. But very often, and this is of course also, well, I just, let me take the example of Hungary, because I know the Hungarian example better for speaking the language, etc. How is Viktor Orban, who has introduced a flat tax, which means the rich people pay less tax and the poor people pay more tax, how is this helping the livelihood of the farmer? How is the lack of investment in education, in healthcare, helping the children or the grandchildren of the farmer? How is it helping him when he needs to go to hospital for being treated for cancer? I mean, these are basic issues which very often this authoritarian populist, the only thing they do is raise pensions before election time. So it's also the role of the other parties to indicate that that's not a structural solution to the poverty in their countries. A structural solution needs to be in a different way than a one-time handout in election time. But of course, you're absolutely right. We should pay more attention. I'm also very concerned about the growing divisions we are seeing between countries, but also among countries when it comes to rich and poor regions, but also people. And I also believe this is key in a democracy. You can't have two big differences, otherwise a democracy is not going to work. I'll leave it there, Valerie.
Thank you so much. Right on time. Thank you so much. This was a vibrant discussion. I think we could spend a lot more time talking about all the issues that are on the table now, but I'm afraid that it's time to hand it over back to Michele to give the final word to Enrico Letta. Thank you both so much for joining us, and I would also like to thank the organizers for involving me. And with that, I hand it back to Michele.
Thanks, Valerie. Thanks, Kata. Thanks, Kati. It was an amazing conversation. Time flies. It's already 1 o'clock. It didn't feel so because, at least for me, it was very engaging and interesting. So now, without further ado, I'll leave the floor to our founder, Enrico Letta, for trying to put all the pieces together and see what lies ahead. Enrico, are you?
Thank you very much, Michele. Thank you all, Valerie. You did a great job in moderating and leading this discussion. Thank you, Dominique. Thank you, Gaetan. Of course, Paolo Gentiloni. And thank you, Kati Piri. And thank you very much, Cotetuto. It was a fantastic session. Thank you, all the participants. I think we had a lot of new ideas. And when last year we left with the idea to continue and to be again together in Budapest, the main idea was to build up Europe as power of values. That was the idea, and that was the reason why we were all together in Budapest. I think we are today at the end of this small edition, ready to work for next year. But I would like just to end up with 3 ideas that came to my mind in these 3 hours. 3 very clear ideas. One, taking again this point about power of values, and also about the topic of a sort of process of citizen awareness, European citizens awareness. That was very important in last hour discussion about, of course, we trust people if people is well informed, and we trust participation of people if people are able to participate in all their capacity. I think we have to work in the next weeks, months, to be sure that values will still be at the very heart of the response of the European Union to recession and to COVID-19. Because what Kati said about, for instance, conditionality, rule of law, structural funds, and the next MFF, I know very well it will be challenged by the need to find an agreement with all the 27 countries of MFF. And if there are 4 frugal countries trying to, I would say, to block the agreement or to stop the agreement and try to be in opposition to the agreement, I will be more than sure that many countries, maybe the presidency of the European Union, will try to have on board the countries from Visegrad, for instance, even Hungary or Poland, even without putting a conditionality environment or telling them that maybe conditionality or next time and not today, just to convince them to vote in favor of the MFF. It is clear that such a deal will be on the table, and we have to avoid such a deal. On values, there's not exchange. This is my key point. And I think our discussion today was raising this point. We don't accept, we don't allow, we don't want to allow any trade on values. Values are not tradable. And that is, I think, a very important point of our discussion today. My second point is about youth. You are the youth. You are a fantastic group of young people spread around Europe, many countries, not only the European Union, also accessing countries. I think what Paolo Gentiloni said about the reaction to a recession is very important on many points, but I would like to underline the point about youth, because last time, 10 years ago, in previous recession, all countries worked with a big mission goal. The big priority was to save and rescue, if I may say, put a safety net for existing jobs. 10 years ago, existing jobs for countries like mine meant something like men between 40 and 60. And so existing jobs, and if we focus all our capacity to react to existing job and trying to save only existing jobs, that means avoiding or refraining to work in helping young people and women at work. So I think we have to be very, very strong and focused in working in the next weeks and months. And I would like that the Budapest European Agora, with all the partners, will try to continue to work in between, working to raise the flag of young people during this pandemic, avoiding to have just answers for existing jobs, but helping also not yet existing jobs, jobs of the future. That is very important, both at European level and at national level. And my third point, and I will end up here, will be on the conference of on the future of Europe. I think we had a fantastic conversation on that, and and would like to really to thank Dominique and Gaetan because it was really a great experience. My point is a proposal. My proposal is that I hope and I would like Budapest European Agora to become one of the places of the conference, one of the protagonists of the conference. I think we are really the best example of a good tool or a perfect protagonist for this conference. Young people coming from all over in Europe without a precise, I would say, political environment, with the aim to be protagonists, proactive. I think we can be a good protagonist for the conference, and we can be part of this civil society, proactive, with a big engagement. And also I underlined one point that Gaetan raised, that was about this sort of terra, when she said the results are unexpected. We don't know what will be the results of the conference. It will be the way in which the conference will be organized, and the way in which protagonists of the conference will bring ideas that will be the outcome of the conference. So we want to be there, we want to give our contribution, and we want to be greater, and we want to be larger in the way in which we will try to involve and the people involved in the conference. So all our organizations, the Jacques Delors Institute in Berlin, in Paris, Scuola di Politiche, Académie Notre Europe, of course, the very important activity of the Bertelsmann Foundation. We think that we can be truly protagonists of the conference on the future of Europe. I think this is our mission. I would like to say that it is, I know very well, it is a very ambitious issue, but we know that this conference will last for maybe 18 months, 20 months. So there's time for at least one, maybe two Budapest European Agora, the 21st edition and the 22nd edition. So I would like just to leave you with this big mission. I like this mission. I would like to be more than involved. I thank Michele for his leadership. I thank all the team working with Michele. I thank the Council of Europe for the cooperation and all the organizations that worked with us. And these 3 missions and this third one, first of all, will be the big missions for our future. Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much, Enrico, for this great words. We will try to live up to the expectations that you set. But most of all, thanks to all of you who joined today. I hope it was a great experience. Thanks, Valerie. Thanks, Kati. Thanks, Kata, and all the speakers that joined us today. And I hope to see you live in Budapest in 2021. Thank you, and have a good day.